Thank you very much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here today together with you. And I'd like to also echo the chair's accolades about the planning committee and the organizing committee and the program committee. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this. You remember yesterday in the first session, we heard it was Madame Gerslain-Lanille talk about, with pride, how much the agricultural research system in France was contributing to the development of French agriculture, supporting French farmers, and so forth. And I thought that was very interesting because I work mostly in Africa, and I hear African leaders talk about the need for developing their own national systems so that they can develop as well and support their farmers in a similar way, as was mentioned yesterday by Madame Gerslain-Lanille. So the topic for this conversation today is about building agricultural research and extension systems in Africa. And I'd like to take a moment just to talk about my co-authors besides myself. There's Jayne Zingore. Jayne is the research director of the African Plant Nutrition Institute, based in Morocco. Amadou Niang from ISRA, based in Dakar. Cheryl Palm, who is an agronomist from the University of Florida. And then Pedro Sanchez, who is a former DG of ECRAF, and he's a prominent agronomist now also based in Florida. So the five of us are put together this study, and the objectives behind it, sorry, let me first go through the organization. I'm going to talk about the motivation for the study first, then the objectives, the methods that we use to derive the findings of this report, and then what does it all mean for African continental organizations like the African Development Bank, Africa Union, as well as national governments themselves, and then the international research community, people, mostly us in this room. Is there any takeaway messages that we may want to consider ourselves? All right, so the motivation for this. You've probably seen graphs like this quite a bit, but it really does speak volumes about the difficulties that African farmers face in raising their yields, especially when they don't have the kind of research and extension system capacity that we have and that have now developed in most other countries of the world. When I was having breakfast this morning with Johan, I was impressed with, he described the case of India, which 40 years ago was far behind the capacity of the developed North in terms of their research capacity. But apparently, the point that the director of the national research system in India was making is that we feel like we can do everything that the international system can do, and we have a $1 billion annual budget to work with. So I thought that was very revealing about the success that some parts of the developing world have had in developing their research and extension capacity. And that has contributed to some yield and productivity growth, as you can see, in South Asia. But by contrast, Africa has a long way to go. So another rationale for why yield growth or productivity growth more generally is needed in Africa is that because, contrary to popular belief, where there's been points raised that Africa has about 60% of the world's remaining arable land, which is true, but as you can see from this graph here, 9 countries account for over 90% of that arable land capacity. So, and many of these states are what could be considered fragile states with difficulty in attracting investment. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa has roughly 50 countries in it, And if these 9 account for 90% of all of the potential for land expansion in Africa, the other 45 countries or so have very limited capacity for area expansion as the source of increased agricultural production. So from this angle as well, Africa really needs to develop its research and extension capacity in order to get yield growth rather than area expansion as the source of its continued food production expansion. And there are many other reasons related to the grand challenges that David just mentioned yesterday about the intersection between agriculture, climate adaptation, resilience, energy. All of these things are further rationale for why Africa cannot wait any longer to develop its own research and extension capacity. So, this point was recognized about the need for adaptive research. It was recognized by one of the first Nobel Prize winners from a developing country. Arthur Lewis was from St. Lucia in the Caribbean, and he made this point that we can benefit from international technology generation in the global north, but that technology to be useful to our farmers in developing countries, it must be adapted. And there must be this bi-directional learning between farmers and researchers so that the technology can be adapted to be appropriate for the conditions of very heterogeneous conditions of soil and rainfall, elevation, and so forth. And you can't just import international technology straight away. It needs to be adapted. So the recognition that developing countries needed their own national research and extension systems has been reflected in this historical division of labor between the CG system and the national agricultural research and extension systems. So that word NARES right here is what that means, National Agricultural Research and Extension Systems, similar to the one that was described yesterday for France. Anyway, this historical division of labor was that the CG would be managing the International Gene Bank, it would be generating improved technologies and know-how, and then transferring them to the NARES. And then once they were in the hands of the NARES would interact with farmers and adapt these technologies and practices to local conditions. And this is not just for technology, but also for economic analysis, like we do. Much of the research that we do, people in this room here, it is generally applicable to many developing countries. But in order for that work to take root and to be put before policymakers and really considered, in some way it needs to be domesticated in local discourse so that it can be turned over and mulled over, and sometimes it takes years, many years, before a certain argument or point can really gain traction and move into policy implementation. So I would submit, Chair, that we really all need strong partners to be working with in the developing countries for the success of our own work. So the motivation for this study is that there's a case for productivity growth. I don't think I need to say more about that. And where does productivity growth come from? It comes from the generation of new and adaptive technology, including local knowledge. Historical, traditional knowledge can be integrated into NARES. So I'm not just talking about modern technology, but the integration of all types of knowledge to support farm productivity and farmers. Well-functioning NARES are certainly not sufficient for achieving these varied objectives, but they are indeed necessary. So a few definitions, if I may. So what are NARES? they constitute 3 or 4 different kinds of organizations. They're all of the public institutions that undertake agricultural research and extension activities, advisory services, and are committed to a nationally defined agenda defined by the national government. So they include the research institute of a country. They include the national agricultural universities and their affiliated institutes. Sometimes there's policy institutes within the national ag universities that support policymakers by undertaking policy analysis or economic analysis. And these national universities also play a crucial role in generating a continuous supply of well-trained national professionals who can then fill the positions of these agricultural institutions in their country. The days are over when these institutes can be really manned by expatriates, and at the moment there's just so much national capacity being developed, and these nationals need to be coming from well-established and effective national universities to increase the human capacity. Then the last part of this is the technical departments of public sector ministries undertaking agricultural research and advisory services. This includes the extension system and the idea of bidirectional learning between farmers and scientists, linked together by an extension service. And then this other term that I'm going to be using today is International Agricultural Research System, or IARS. And within the IARS, you have the CG organizations, like IFPRI, ILRI, CIMMYT, ECRAF, et cetera, et cetera. You have the international research universities, like the one I worked for myself for 35 years, Michigan State University. Wageningen is a very good example of one in Europe. There's so many of them that are supporting capacity development in Africa. Then the third group would be the international funding partners and other organizations, the UN organizations based in Rome, FAO, et cetera, World Bank, the foundations, and the bilateral, multilateral donors. So all of these groups are what I mean when I'm talking about IARS, the International Research System. And while I won't expect you all to look at the fine print here, the point that I want to make is that in green, this is the public sector, the NAREs themselves, and they interact in a very complex ecosystem together with not only the CG group and the International Research System down here in blue, but also the private sector in yellow, and then these other independent organizations that are donor-funded and that are also involved in providing policy support and scientific research in Africa. An example of that would be AGRA, based in Nairobi. Okay, so the objectives now. The objectives of this study are, number one, to understand the factors limiting the performance of African NAREs, National Ag Research and Extension Systems. And then two, to understand how the International Ag Research System, IARS, can strengthen the capacity of African NAREs. Now, our methods. When we undertook this study, we tried to look at what sources of data already existing could we rely upon to reveal the kind of behavioral interactions and sometimes strategic interactions between the international system organizations and the African NAREs. And we concluded that even though there's a lot of statistical information about funding levels and number of master's and PhD level people trained in particular areas, we believed that that by itself would not be sufficient to really have a detailed understanding of the interactions between the international and the African research system. Most of the available data really lacks the depth or the nuance to shed light on many of these complex institutional behavioral issues. Here's an example. If you look over time at spending on African agricultural R&D organizations, you see that in blue, the African governments have increased their spending over time. And then in orange there on the bottom is the CG spending on collaboration and capacity building activities with African Naris. And you see that the CG spending has roughly doubled over the last roughly 20 years. But that by itself kind of doesn't reveal to us very much about the complexity of these interactions. So what we decided to do was conduct a qualitative analysis by interviewing a number of senior representatives of both international research organizations, both in the CG as well as in international universities and in the World Bank and FAO and so forth. And then we tried to interview equal numbers of senior representatives in the African Naris themselves. So this key informant approach is based on 26 interviews that lasted about 2 hours each. They were quite in depth. And we feel like this was one of the ways to really uncover some of the fundamental constraints to capacity development in Africa. Some of the people we interviewed were former DGs of international centers, former directors of some of the African research organizations themselves. And then we also interviewed 3 representatives of donor organizations and foundations as well. Now, this approach has limitations for sure, but it may be suitable in contexts where issues are simply too complex to yield insights from quantitative data alone. Randomness, I want to be clear, was an issue for us. You can imagine the difficulty in developing a population, a list of all of the relevant individuals, both in the international system as well as in African research organizations. We did develop lists that were fairly long, but we probably left out some people, and we drew from that list. So we feel that the list of international key informants was somewhat representative, but we did have a high non-response rate. And then with the African Naris, of which there are 50 countries, each of them with hundreds of senior staff, we had to narrow down our geographical focus. So we selected Malawi and Kenya, which were examples of an Anglophone research and extension system. Senegal, an example of a Francophone extension system, Ethiopia, and then Nigeria. These 4 countries together constitute about 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's population. So even though there's only 4 or 5 countries here, it did constitute quite a large proportion of Africa's farmers. Our key informant interviews followed 3 steps. We had 9 open-ended questions that were shared in advance with each key informant pertaining to the strengths and the weaknesses, opportunities and threats that are facing African Naris. And then in their experience, what were some of the key problems that they had in their efforts to work with and build the capacity of African Naris. The video and written transcripts through Otter AI software were recorded for each key informant. Transcripts were then reviewed and summarized by all 5, independently by all 5 authors. And then after all of the 29 interviews were conducted, we grouped responses into these recurrent themes that we found that were emerging from these 29 interviews. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've tried to get through the 3 points here in the presentation. I'm now going to move to the main findings, of which there are 5. The first theme is that building strong national ag research and extension systems will initially require a regional approach for many, but not all, African countries. Roughly 20 African countries, 20 out of 50, virtually have no functional ag research system. It just simply, they don't have one, it's not funded, or their university system is not capable of producing a steady supply of qualified national professionals to operate the national extension system. So about 20 of these countries at least will need to form a regional approach, and a report that was put out by IFPRI for the Africa Union a couple of years ago by Stats et al. Proposed organizing a regional R&D by agroecology. Let's say that the humid tropics, the subhuman tropics, the Sahel region, and so forth, rather than just by national organization. There are some countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Ghana that do have fairly good, by African standards, fairly good national ag research and extension systems, and are functioning and doing some of the tasks that was described yesterday morning that the French system is doing here. But not many, and there might be 5 or 6 that are functional like that. A second point, Chair, is that almost every key informant talked about the low levels of funding that African governments make to their own national system. So even though they recognize the importance of agriculture, they don't reflect that in the way they allocate their budgets. In some countries, maybe 90% of national government's expenditures to agriculture is on input subsidy programs, marketing board operations, and so forth, leaving very, very little for agricultural extension services and agricultural research. And this graph kind of highlights the point. If let's just take the bottom, which looks at the R&D expenditures per farm worker, and here's Sub-Saharan Africa right there, Latin America, West and North Africa, Asia, they just spend multiple times per farmer than in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then on the bottom right, we divided R&D expenditures by the area under cultivation. And again, Sub-Saharan Africa turns out to be quite low. By just about any metric, they're spending quite low levels compared with the rest of the world. And so therefore, it's not surprising why this graph should be the case, why we should see such low levels of productivity growth over time. There are many factors at play, of course, but certainly this one, I think, is one of the central points. And that's what key informants were telling us. Theme 3, when it comes to the interactions between international donors and research organizations, most of the key informants said that the international donors can be doing a lot more to build the capacity of African NAREs and regional organizations. At this point, it's important to make a distinction between individual capacity development and institutional capacity development. Many of the key informants, many of the African key informants in particular, felt that the international research system and donor system was strengthening individual capacity quite well. But the majority of the key informants felt that the international organizations were not strengthening institutional capacity of the NARES. 81% of the key informants in the international system that we interviewed felt that the IRs their efforts were either inadequate or ineffective in promoting capacity development at the institutional level. And a smaller proportion, but still a majority, of the African representatives of the NARES also felt that the international research system was not doing that much to promote institutional capacity development. Now, I'll give you a little flavor just by a few of the quotes that some of the key informants gave us. One talked about a major brain drain from the NARES to the international research system. So after receiving training, many African researchers are hired into positions within the international research system, building the institutional capacity of the IRs and widening the capacity gap between international and African research organizations. The CG is moving too far into the territory that national research and extension systems should be covering. The CG and NARES should have a more clear division of labor, but because NARES have been weak, the international system has naturally encroached, et cetera, et cetera. This last one I thought was very good too. The CG has still not developed a compelling vision for how to work with the NARES, though there are some notable exceptions, and they gave two cases here. But in general, the CGIR is not really helping build capacity of the NARES. I think in the interests of time, I'm going to go just kind of get through this. Now, this study is not the first to make these points. There are other studies that have looked into capacity development efforts, and here's one right here that was done, an evaluation for the CG about 15 years ago. Now, it wasn't all like that. I want to be clear that about 25%, 26% of the key informants felt that the CG had faithfully worked with NARES to strengthen their capacity and feel that the CG is adequately focused on capacity development. 6 key informants in particular, 6 out of 29, point to specific examples of success in improving the capacity of NARES. One key informant from an African organization stated, "In my own experience, I think individual scientists from the NARES really enjoy working with the CG. It really gives them exposure to new tools, new methods, new networks." So there's variability in responses to that issue. A fourth theme that came out very prominently is that the success or the effectiveness of international organizations' work and the CG and indeed our own individual work does depend on the performance of these national partners, and that the impacts of the international centers has indeed been limited in areas lacking well-functioning NARES. There was a consensus that international research organizations are not well-suited to scale out technical innovations on their own across highly varied agroecological conditions in Africa, nor do they have the resources to do so. So strong national and regional partners on the ground are needed to increase the impact of international research efforts. That was the fourth theme. And then the fifth one, final one, was to confront this issue of donor creation of organizations that duplicate the activities of the NARES. So what does this mean exactly? Some donor organizations have been reluctant to directly partner with public sector entities, and so they tend to create their own new organizations on the ground that at least partially duplicate or overlap with activities carried out by the national ag research and extension system themselves. The impact of these donor-created organizations may well be detrimental on the capacity development of NARES, as the hiring practices of these donor-created organizations often draws the best talent within the NAREs into these new donor-created systems, because they have major budgets and they can pay well, so they can afford to attract people out of the NAREs, which thereby weakens and even marginalizes these national African organizations. So quite a number of key informants spoke of resentment and lack of cooperation and adverse impacts in various ways on the NAREs that have resulted from this. Even though these donor-created organizations may be doing many good things, it's important to consider the sort of overall systemic impacts on the overall system performance. So even though an organization itself may be doing good things, the impact on the entire system itself may well be adverse. Such were the conclusions, anyway, of about half of the key informants that we spoke to. Okay, thank you. So let me then move to the conclusions and the implications. So priority actions, who must do what? We came to the conclusion, now this is us talking as authors, this isn't the key informant survey anymore. We felt that this really is for the African continental organizations themselves to play the catalytic role in addressing the situation. What can they do? The African Development Bank, the Africa Union, NEPAD, they can encourage, first of all, encourage African governments to live up to their Maputo Declaration commitments and then invest more in their own R&D systems. And it's our observation that there seems to be a continued underappreciation of the contribution that agricultural R&D makes to agricultural productivity growth. Even though I think this is well established and well understood in the global north, in the global south, there seems to be uneven understanding of the importance of having well-funded R&D systems. The AFDB has a considerably expanded capital base, which it could use to create new regional architecture for agricultural research organized by agroecology, as was advised or promoted by the Stat et al. IFPRI report from a couple of years ago that I talked about earlier. A second set of activities would be encouraging international donors to strengthen direct partnership with the NAREs themselves and reduce reliance on donor-created organizations that actually duplicate the activities of the NAREs. A fourth point would be to emphasize institutional and not just individual capacity development as a key criteria for the grants that international donors and foundations make. Individual capacity development is extremely important as a part of institutional capacity development, but it certainly is not a sufficient condition for institutional capacity development. Much more is involved in that. Encouraging donors to involve NAREs as grant co-awardees and co-directorships is also a step that donors can be taking in that direction. So this historical 20th century model where the international system generates technology, improved practices, improved analysis, and then transfers that to African NAREs, this model may need to be reevaluated just in light of its functioning over the past 20 or 30 years. Today, we recognize that there's much greater capacity in Africa or among Africans to manage their organizations compared to 30 years ago. Current research conditions warrant what we're calling a 21st century model of agricultural research, in which African continental and regional development organizations and national governments take control and accountability of the agenda, how agricultural research is prioritized, and that goes for economic research as well as research on breeding and crop science and agronomy and so forth. And then lastly, distinguish between individual and institutional capacity development. Recognize how funding of the international research system, how its impact depends on the performance of the national partners. It's a system, and in the system performs according to the strength of the weakest link in that chain. Last slide, Mr. Chair. It is largely an issue of aligning incentives with objectives. If the funders of agricultural grants value institutional capacity development at the national level, then they will elevate institutional capacity building to a major objective of their own grants that they make. And they will insist on grant outcomes that achieve those objectives. The international research system will then have the incentives to prepare grant proposals and budgets that achieve those outcomes. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.